Hi, welcome to week 5 of History 358. Um, this week we're going to be talking about economic policy and activity during the Civil War and the immediate aftermath. And we've talked a lot about the Civil War as a formative experience for the young Bolshevik regime, as a formative experience for the young men and women who came of age during those years. The Civil War was also a formative moment in the development of Bolshevik policy in terms of the sorts of techniques that the Bolsheviks would deploy on the economic front, in terms of their attitude towards culture building, their attitude towards the social reconfiguration of the population, in accordance with their Marxist vision for the restructuring of society. But I want to think about economics this week, and it's important to remember that the Bolsheviks in power inherited an economy that was in ruins, thanks to the First World War, the revolutions, and the Civil War that followed. Not only was the economy in ruins, and we'll look at some statistics that demonstrate that, but we're also talking about a demographic crisis. 10 million people had died in the First World War and the Civil War combined. And the task of refitting the economy, putting the economy back together again, reconstituting a skilled labor force to replace those who had perished, to move the economy onto a new socialist footing, to make the jump from capitalism into socialism. All of this would have been a tremendous challenge under ideal circumstances. But in the chaos of civil war, the challenge was enormous. So I want to show you, let me jump to the slides here and show you what we're going to be focusing on today. As we look at the period of war communism, we talk about war communism, in Russian, Военный коммунизм, literally war communism. We're talking about a series of policies and political directives from this period of the Civil War, policies that were generated in the crucible of civil war, policies that were generated in response to the realities of civil war, and policies that were also aimed at catapulting forward from chaos into socialism. The Civil War was a crisis for the economy, and the Bolsheviks recognized this. How could they not? And so the coercive policies, the violent top-down command-style policies of war communism are a response to the chaos unleashed by civil war. But also, as we'll see momentarily, there's a kind of utopian thrust. Out of this crisis, out of this chaos, comes an opportunity, the Bolsheviks imagine. An opportunity to pole vault forward, to hurtle forward from the debris and rubble of the now fallen capitalist order straight forward into a true socialist economy. Those expectations, as we'll see today, prove disastrous. And war communism does not long outlast the Civil War itself. In fact, war communism is really, we can date, I think, from 1918 through 1921. It will be replaced, as we see in the second lecture this week, by a new and more accommodating economic policy. So the big thing I want us to think about today as we sort of trace the characteristics of war communism is to really sort of see it as an economic extension of the kinds of class-driven, coercive policies that the Bolsheviks unleashed in the context of civil war. In some ways, you might think of war communism as an economic continuation of the principles of civil war and their application to the economic sphere. I'm going to draw your attention to this Russian word. It's a good Russian word that you'll often encounter in reading about the Civil War and the era of war communism, the Russian word razrucha, which means total collapse, not just collapse, not just disintegration, but total, utter collapse and disintegration. And in sources from this period, this is the word, razrucha, that's used time and again to describe the collapse of industry, the collapse of infrastructure, lines of transportation, lines of communication, the normal exchange of goods and services, the normal functioning of a currency-based money economy. All of this ceased to function during the Civil War. And so war communism, in its most pragmatic sense, is an attempt to overcome the complete razrucha of the Bolshevik Russian economy. Some characteristics of war communism that I want to draw your attention to. The nationalization of the economy, the nationalization of economic activity. And what this means is sort of a natural extension of what the Bolsheviks had promised throughout 1917, taking industry, banking, transportation, especially the railroads, foreign trade out of private hands and putting them under the control of the state. So we refer to these kinds of policies whereby industry, or in Marxist terms, the means of production, are transferred from private hands into public hands, into state hands, as nationalization. And this is a key aspect of war communism. So what this meant was that with the introduction of war communism, economic power is now concentrated in the hands of the state, and it will be administered by a highly bureaucratized, highly centralized system. War communism aimed also at the elimination of a money-based, currency-based economy, trying to move away from monetary forms of exchange, which, as we know from our own daily lives, characterize economic life in a capitalist society. So eliminating the old and discredited, in their eyes, capitalist era style of exchange and replacing it in principle with a system of economic exchange more suited for socialist norms. And we'll see how this takes force when we look at the policies of peasant requisitioning, which is literally just taking grain from peasants by agents of the state. So we have, as another key aspect of war communism, the deployment of coercive techniques, militarized tactics, the kinds of techniques and tactics, strategies of state violence that we saw last week, applied with a rapid tempo. We'll talk about centralized economic planning and how that worked or failed to work, and the utopian goal, again, of catapulting forward from the rubble of capitalism into socialism. So, the other point I want to emphasize in this lecture then is as with many early Bolshevik policies, there is both a pragmatic side, a side driven by need, driven by necessity, and there's also this sort of utopian desire to turn a crisis into an opportunity and put into practice Marxist theory. So we'll use the crisis of Razrucha to build a socialist economy from the rubble of capitalism. We'll do so through the kinds of coercive techniques that we have cultivated on the military front of the Civil War, and we will make that transition from the capitalist order to the new socialist order. So these are the kinds of goals of war communism. Lenin described war communism in 1919 in these terms. The goal of war communism, Lenin says, is to continue undeviatingly to replace trade and economic activity by planned, governmentally organized distribution of goods and products. The party will strive for the most rapid implementation of the most radical measures for the abolition of money and to replace, again, a money economy with a system whereby individuals would receive goods and services based on the level of contribution they made to the production of said goods and services. So again, a class-based approach to the state distribution of economic resources in society. Obviously very, very different from a capitalist model. A couple of words in Lenin's remarks here I think are worth highlighting. The adjectives rapid and radical. We'll see how rapid and radical these economic transformations are. Trotsky, you see him here saluting the troops. Trotsky, writing in 1920, is even more blunt than Lenin. He says, having taken over the means of production, the proletariat is obliged, under the pressures of iron necessity, to learn by their own experience how to organize a socialist economy. This is somewhat disingenuous. The proletariat will not have to learn how to organize a socialist economy. Bolshevik commissars, party leaders will have to learn how to organize a socialist economy. But this last line of Trotsky's is, I think, rather telling, and it points again to this idea of coercion in the economic sphere. He says, once the rider has mounted the saddle, he is obliged to guide the horse, even at the peril of breaking its neck. So the party has jumped atop the horse of revolution, and the party must guide the revolution forward, even if it means breaking the horse's neck, or even if it means that individuals will perish as we make this leap forward into the new socialist order. And again, as we've seen so far, that was a sacrifice that party commissars and party leaders were more than willing to make in their calculation that the ends justify the means, right? So this question of economic planning is at the heart of war communism. And on December 2nd, 1917, the Council of People's Commissars announced the establishment of the Supreme Council for the National Economy, known by its Russian initials as VSNH. And the mission of VSNH was to, quote, elaborate general norms and plans for regulating the economic life of the country, reconciling and coordinating the activities of economic agencies and actors in the country. So, in plain speak, what this means is that VSNH, the Supreme Council for the National Economy, is going to draft and implement plans, quotas on economic production, how much steel will be produced, how many lines and kilometers of rail will be laid, how many new units of housing will be built, how many shoes will be created. Also, the Supreme Council is to, in the words of its charter, reconcile and coordinate the activities of economic agencies. What this means is VSNH is now going to supervise trade unions and factory committees. So remember, the whole point of October was to empower the workers, all power to the Soviets, all power to the councils of workers and soldiers and sailors and poor peasants. Now that power is being taken out of the hands of workers and put under the auspices of party planners. This poster that you see here is from 1925-26, a brief period when Felix Dzerzhinsky was the head of VSNH. And he wasn't the first head. There were two guys before him, Asinsky and Rykov, not important. But I think it's a very telling detail that Iron Felix, the head of the Cheka, the chief policeman of the Soviet Union, was also for a time in the 20s, the head of VSNK. And just as the Cheka was seeking to implement its own vision of social order upon the population, so too did VSNK seek to implement a kind of orderliness to the fledgling Bolshevik Soviet economy. And you see here this sort of industrial gauge. We are here at the bottom. We need to get our production up to 100%. And you see this sort of montage of various scenes from Soviet industry, the Dynamo factory, new construction taking place here. All of this, literally in this image, overseen by the watchful eyes of the chairman of VSNK, Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky himself. So the coordination of economic life and the reconciliation and coordination of the activities of trade unions, what this meant in a concrete sense was that in January of 1918, the whole nationwide committee of trade unions, factory floor committees, these are taken out of the hands of workers themselves and put under the supervision and control of the party members and bureaucrats who administer the Supreme Council, VSNK. So this is the establishment of VSNK and its charter. This is the first step that we see towards the establishment of a planned, centralized economy, a so-called command economy. We'll talk more about this when we get to the Stalin period. But when we talk about a command economy, and that's basically the kind of economic system that will exist in the Soviet Union until the collapse of 91, with some modification at the end. But a command economy is very different from a market-driven economy, right? In a market-driven economy, consumer input plays some role. There are the forces of supply and demand, however ineluctable those may be, they're there, and markets, in principle, at least so we've been told since the time of Adam Smith, respond accordingly. A command economy does not worry about market forces of supply and demand. It doesn't worry about the vagaries of such things. A command economy, such as the Soviets are trying to implement here, is an economy based on decrees, instructions, and orders from above. It's a top-down planned economy. So what the Bolshevik regime is doing from the very beginning is attempting to circumvent the market, make an end run around market forces, and control all economic activity from above by planning, by regulation. The party can sort of pull the strings of the economy, administer it as needed, pull it in whatever direction needs of the moment may require. So a planned economy can fix production priorities. Right? We'll do this first, then this, then this. This is the most important, this is the least important. A command economy, in principle, can allocate resources more effectively. We need to build more rail lines this year and fewer tractors. So we're going to move steel out of the tractor factories and into the rail factories. A command economy can determine prices and set wages. And as we'll see, during the Stalin period, there are certain efficiencies that come about through a command economy. The problem is that command economies are not well suited to responding to consumer needs. Their focus is generally on heavy industry, not light industry, and so consumers grow dissatisfied with a command-style economy that cannot satisfy their consumer needs. We'll talk more about that in weeks to come. So VSNK is going to be the agency that will administer on behalf of the party and state all economic activity in the country. And by the summer of 1918, more than 1,000 factories and private industries have been nationalized. Again, they've been taken out of private ownership and placed under direct control of the state and party. This poster shows a group of workers and militiamen celebrating this. Long live the transfer of all factories and plants into the hands of the Soviet Republic. So to give you some sense of how overwhelming this transfer was, in 1914, on the eve of World War I, the imperial regime, the Tsarist regime, controlled about 10% of the national economy. By 1921, the new Soviet regime controlled directly 80 to 90% of the economy. So this is a huge sea change in a relatively short period of time. Over the course of the Civil War, all industry has come into state hands. Private enterprise has essentially ceased to exist. But when we talk about industry coming into state hands, we're talking about, again, an industry that is in shambles. The Civil War and all of the destruction that it wrought, plus the loss of manpower, plus the loss of raw materials, and the inability to get raw materials to factories, all of this razrucha, destruction, collapse, all of this combines to plunge production levels well below their pre-war indices. So I want to show you this graph. It's bear with me here. This graph shows indices of industrial production. Indices is just the plural of index. So a series of indexes or indices of industrial production from 1913, taking 1913 as a baseline, through 1920. So if we take 1913, the last year of peace, if we take industrial production levels in Russia in 1913 as a base level of 100, what we see is that over the next 7 years, that figure tumbles precipitously. In 1917, 3 years into the war and the year of revolution, that figure of industrial production is down to 74.8%. So the Russian industrial economy is only producing 3/4 of what it had in 1913. By 1918, that's down to 33.8%. By 1919, it's fallen in half again to 14.9%. And in 1920, the industrial economy, by which we mean all levels of industrial production, is only at 12.8% of pre-war levels. Now, again, these are aggregate figures, totaling industry as a whole. If we break that down and look at specific key branches of industry, the decline is even more terrifying. Iron and steel, for instance. By 1921, iron and steel production in Soviet Russia was only 5% of what it had been in 1913. 5%. Agricultural production was similarly devastated during this period. Agricultural crop yields, which had always been lower in Russia than in Western Europe and the United States, thanks to scientific, technological developments that were just simply not available in the Russian Empire. But the Civil War and armies marauding across the plains led to agricultural crop yields being cut in half. What this meant was that less land was being cultivated, less grain was being grown and harvested, less food was coming into the cities. The cities are starving during the years of Civil War. And the lack of food coming in makes life in the cities unimaginably difficult. Just to give you a few examples, in Moscow, the price of potatoes doubles between January 1918 and April. The price of rye flour to make traditional dark bread quadruples. And workers' wages cannot keep up. Wages have plummeted. The real purchasing power of a factory worker's wages in 1919 in the capital, Petersburg, Petrograd, was 2% of its pre-war value. 2%. So not only is little work being done in the factories, but the factory workers can, in reality, purchase nothing with their increasingly useless Bolshevik-issued money. So the Bolsheviks rely on rations. Again, this is part of circumventing the money economy, replacing it with a mode of exchange in keeping with Bolshevik class-based values. So rations are introduced by the new regime. Now, all the combatant nations in World War I issued rations. The Imperial Russian government, Britain, France, Germany, they all issued rations. The Bolsheviks continue rationing, both for reasons of need and necessity, but also for reasons of using rationing as a way to mold or cull society in accordance with their ideological vision of what it ought to be. State-issued ration cards to workers were worth the equivalent of 900 calories per day. Now, rations were apportioned based on one's social class. So the former people, bывшие люди, receive nothing or next to nothing. Factory workers, the most privileged, treasured class in the workers' state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, receive the most, but they're only getting the equivalent of 900 calories a day, and most of that in bread. They're not getting sufficient protein. They're not getting sufficient vegetables, fats, etc. Here you see a photograph of firewood that's being rationed. So not just food, but firewood, heating oil, basic supplies for daily life were being rationed by state agencies to the population. Now, what happens if workers are starving? And they're starving. As workers become more and more malnourished, workers succumb to exhaustion. On the average day in the average factory in Petrograd, Petersburg, 30% of the workforce would be absent. In the metalworking industry, absenteeism was often as high as 80%. And this obviously crippled production. You have immediate problems of how you're going to feed a family on the meager rations allocated you by state agencies. Many women resort to prostitution, selling themselves for loaves of bread. There were 30,000 prostitutes on the streets of Petrograd in 1918. There's a mass depopulation, a wave of exodus from the cities during the years of civil war. Moscow loses half of its population. The population of Petrograd falls by 70%. And what is the element or segment of the population that is fleeing the cities? It's the workers. The number of workers active, employed, on the job falls from about 3.5 million in the middle of 1917 to barely over 1 million by 1920. One of the old Bolsheviks, Alexander Shliapnikov, remarked with great irony that the Bolsheviks have become the vanguard of a non-existent class. Where is the proletariat? What has become of the proletariat? Urban dwellers during the Civil War flee the city, as I said, to go to the countryside because that's where the food is. So urban dwellers pack up their stuff and they head for the villages to live with family members, relatives. Able-bodied men are joining the Red Army, not necessarily out of ideological conviction, but because they can at least get food to eat. The village during the Civil War is a relatively more prosperous place to be than the cities. The peasants are growing food. The peasants are bringing food into the cities and selling it to urban residents at a profit. And they were known during the Civil War, these peasant merchants, sort of working on the margins of the black market, the so-called second economy. They were known as bagmen. because they would take their bags of grain and their bags of food, sneak them into the cities underneath the watchful eyes of the Cheka, um, and sell or barter their food for profit. Um, Life in the cities was very rough, and I've asked you to read that short story, The Cave, by Zamyatin, to get some sense of what life was like in Petrograd during those hungry years. Zamyatin uses this sort of metaphor of Petrograd as a city that has kind of gone back to a sort of prehistoric past. Its depopulated streets are home to men and women who are scouring urban space to find some food for themselves. The great Russian writer Maxim Gorky wrote in 1918, "Petrograd is dying as a city. Everyone is abandoning it, by foot, by horse, by train. Dead horses lie in all the streets. The dogs eat them. The city is unbelievably dirty. The Moika Canal and Fontanka Canal are full of rubbish. This is the death of Russia." And Gorky was not alone in registering uh, these sort of apocalyptic visions of a country that was falling apart at the seams. So war communism is an attempt to rectify this disastrous situation of starving, abandoned cities, industrial production in utter collapse, and to solve the food crisis. One of the most notable features of war communism, and you can see here the connection between Civil War era discipline and the economic policies of war communism, one of the key features of war communism was compulsory labor, which came in different forms. Peasants and workers were conscripted by agents of the state and by Red Army officers to serve in labor battalions, to serve in labor armies. And these labor armies were commanded by party officials, Cheka agents, and Red Army officers to build roads, cut trees, lay railroad track. Um, Trotsky, in fact, used whole divisions of the Red Army to perform these kinds of labor duties. When there was a lull in the fighting on a particular front, Trotsky would send them out to fell timber or lay railroad track, rebuild roads. Trotsky and others described this as the militarization of labor, applying military discipline to the economic problem of labor allocation. And obviously this is the coercive side, right? The stick side. But the carrot side is a very clever tool, and we'll see this again in the Stalin years. The state, the regime introduces bonuses, incentives in the form of increased ration cards for workers who are over fulfilling the production goals set for them. Those who exceed the norms are given these honorific titles of shock worker. And Lenin calls this the socialist competition of labor. And this is a good thing, he says. Competition, friendly competition, is good. The exploitative competition of the capitalist system is destructive and bad, but in the interests of building the socialist economy, we can encourage individual workers to engage in a friendly, healthy competition to see who among them can best fulfill, indeed over-fulfill, the quotas and norms set for them. And again, those who did were entitled to all manner of trinkets and baubles and bonuses. We'll see this again, as I said, when we get to the Stalin era. The number one issue, though, facing Lenin is not the socialist competition of labor, it's the food problem. And this is not any sort of humanitarianism on Lenin's part. It's a direct, immediate need. If food is not getting from the countryside to the cities, the workers will starve. If the workers starve, there's no industrial production. If there's no industrial production, we can't build guns. We can't produce bullets. We can't produce the basic necessities that we need to defend ourselves against the capitalist imperialist powers that seek to destroy us. So either we feed the cities, either we solve the food problem, or our socialist experiment will be strangled in the cradle. So the solution that Lenin and the party stumble upon is to create what he calls a food dictatorship. We will requisition by force food from the countryside, from the village, in order to feed the cities. Peasants would be permitted to keep a bare minimum of food to sustain themselves and their families, but the rest has to be handed over to agents of the state in order to support the war effort, to win the Civil War, to feed the industrial workers, to keep the factories running, to build back up production levels. And so in the summer of 1918, the Combiedi are established. Combiedi, the committees of poor peasants. They were set up by local party officials in the villages to wage class war against the kulaks, the wealthier peasants. And the idea is to target the kulaks and to turn the villagers against each other, right? What Lenin wants to do is mobilize the poorest peasants and the so-called middle peasants, mobilize them and turn them against a scapegoated target, the kulak, the wealthy peasant. And this is a way for Lenin and the party to deflect blame. The food crisis is not the fault of Soviet power. The food crisis is not the fault of the Bolshevik Revolution and what it stands for. The food crisis is attributable to the enemies of Soviet power, the kulak chief among them. So here you see a cartoon from the time. It asks the peasants the question, who is against the requisitionings? And the answer is clear: the priest, the kulak, and the white guardsman. Right? The enemies of Soviet power, who pretend to be the friends of the peasants, the priests, the kulak, and the white guardsmen, they are in fact against the requisitioning, because the requisitioning is what keeps their bellies fat, as you can see in the paunchy profiles of all three men. So this is what Lenin has to say in the summer of 1918, blaming the kulaks for the food crisis. The kulaks are the rabid foes of Soviet power. These bloodsuckers have grown rich off the hunger of the people. These spiders have grown fat at the expense of peasants ruined by the war, at the expense of the factory workers. These leeches have sucked the blood of the working people and grown richer, while the workers in cities and factories have starved. We must declare ruthless war against the kulaks, death to all of them. Again, we'll see this on a far grander scale when we get to the Stalin era and the policies of collectivization. But this use of selective violence, state violence, against particular segments of the population, a state-driven, ideologically driven class war, is there from the very beginning of the Soviet project. The only question is, who is the particular enemy of the moment, the enemy du jour? Well, the kulaks are, from the very beginning, targets. And the kulaks will be the targets of the Combiedi. The Combiedi, the committees of poor peasants, write up lists identifying which households in the village are poor peasants and which are kulaks. And then when the food requisitioning armies come, the food armies descend on the village, they have the lists prepared by the Combiedi, and they go to the homes of the kulaks. In the summer of 1918, August, right as the harvest is beginning, so begins the requisitioning campaign. These food armies descend on the village. The food armies, and here you see a photograph of some of the young men serving in these food armies. They're made up of Red Army soldiers. They're made up of party members from the village and from the city, urban workers. They go through the villages with the assistance of these combiadi, they ransack peasant homes and they take all the food they can to the cities, often leaving the peasants, the wealthier peasants, with next to nothing. In their zeal to overfulfill the plan set for them, the food armies take food also from the poor peasants and the middle peasants as well. Um, by the summer of 1919, there are 45,000 soldiers in the so-called food army, scouring the Russian countryside, scouring the Russian village for grain. In the interests of socialist competition of labor, they are supposed to uh, overfulfill the plan set for them. VSNH and the People's Commissariat of Food have set ridiculous quotas that have zero basis in reality. In 1920, the party decides that the food armies must requisition 9.5 million tons of grain, a number they pluck out of thin air. In reality, the food armies are able only to collect half of that, and at enormous cost of human life, suffering, torment, etc. This is not a peaceable handover. This is a forcible requisitioning. The difference, you can think about it this way. Requisitioning usually happens at gunpoint. Requisitioning happens down the barrel of a gun, a rifle, right? The peasants aren't lined up, smiling, ready to turn over their grain. These guys are armed for a reason. Now, when the peasants fail to supply the food armies with sufficient grain, this failure is read by the Bolsheviks, interpreted by the Bolsheviks, through that hard-eyed lens of the Civil War. The failure of the peasants to produce grain is not a failure of the crops. It's not a simple inability to come up with numbers that have no basis in reality. The peasants' failure to produce sufficient grain, the Bolsheviks declare, is a failure of will. They're not trying hard enough. The reality is there's no grain to give. And many in the food army came to realize this. One of the food army men serving in the Volga region, a rich agricultural region of rural Russia, writes in 1920, "It is already clear to me that any measures to collect the grain this year will be doomed from the start, and that the results, if there are any at all, will be extremely insignificant. There is simply no grain left to take. The comrades who read my report will no doubt suspect me of localism." In other words, I'm soft on the local population to which I have some ties. He says, that's not the point. That's not the case. I have lived through more than 1 year of hunger in Moscow, and I am just as eager as my comrades and superiors are to take as much surplus grain as possible for the starving workers in the north. But I repeat, whatever measures are taken, it will be impossible to achieve any positive results. And this is from a guy on the ground, as it were, a man serving in the food armies, writing to his superiors, informing them that there is no more grain left to take. The Bolshevik propaganda machine tries to appeal to the peasants and tries to get them on board with the process of requisition. You see a sort of 3-panel cartoon here. Peasant, if you don't want to turn back the clock, and you see here a peasant man, a peasant woman suffering under the whip and rifle, or whip and pistol of the Tsarist police. Peasant, if you don't want to turn back the clock, then we must fulfill the requisitioning. Give the worker grain. And here you see these stacks of grain lined up. Remember, the worker is our brother. And you see a worker and a peasant, the hammer, and there's no sickle here, but the representation of collaboration between the working population and the peasant population. It's the duty of the peasant to supply and feed the worker. Now, we could speculate as to how effective these kinds of images were, um, and maybe at the beginning, some peasants, particularly those who sympathized with the Bolshevik project, were on board with the plan. But you can only requisition so much, as that letter from the Food Army soldier reminds us, before the peasants start turning on you. And there is mass resistance by 1919. Villagers write letters, village councils write letters to the Soviet government, to Lenin himself, and the state archives of the Russian Federation have preserved thousands and thousands of these petitions, um, calling for relief, saying, please stop the food armies. Right? We've just had a revolution to liberate us from the exploitation of man by man. How can you justify what you are doing to us? Comrades, there must be some mistake. A lot of these petitions mention that the peasants are openly grumbling, openly muttering that life was better under the Tsar than it is today under the commissars, under the Soviets, under the Bolshevik regime. And when the Cheka reads these reports, they get nervous because such utterances can only be expressions of potential counter-revolutionary activity. So the result of requisitioning is that the rural population is turned against Soviet power. Remember that the rural population had never been great supporters of Bolshevism from the beginning. Some, again, turn to soft means of protest, petitions, demonstrations, letters of appeal. Others adopt more violent means of resistance. By October 1918, just a few months into the campaign, 7,000 food requisitioners have been killed by angry peasants. In some villages, peasants burned their grain warehouses to the ground rather than supply the food armies with foodstuffs. Most dangerous from the perspective of the regime is that the requisitioning policy sparks organized armed resistance among peasants in the Volga region. By the late summer, early fall of 1920, there was a full-scale armed insurrection taking place in the agricultural heartland of Tambov province. And last week when we talked about the Civil War, I mentioned the various fighting factions, the so-called Greens, who are fighting against the Reds and the Whites, but particularly against the Reds, were based here in Tambov. You have 11,000 peasants and Red Army deserters who are up in revolt in Tambov. Did I say 11,000? Strike that. 110,000. Excuse me, I misread my own notes here. 110,000 armed peasants and Red Army deserters in Tambov province alone fighting a civil war against Soviet power. In parts of Ukraine, sort of off the map here, in parts of Western Siberia, you have a total of another 60,000 peasants in arms. And the great threat here is that the peasants will disrupt or sever completely the rail lines that connect European Russia to Siberia, which would be disastrous in the context of civil war. So you have a disastrous, explosive situation. And the tragic human side of this is famine. Years of war, food requisitioning, mass conscription, all of this has devastated agricultural production. On top of that, you have a horrific drought that takes place in the most productive regions of Russia in 1920 and repeats again in 1921. A natural disaster, an incredibly bad harvest, which does nothing to alter the Bolsheviks' quotas on grain requisitioning, mind you, but it makes an already bad situation worse. And it turns into a famine. If you're interested, there's a great book by Mike Davis called Late Victorian Holocausts, and he chooses that title quite deliberately, but he looks at how British imperial policy in India in the late 19th century produced suffering and death on a scale hitherto unprecedented. And he draws clear lines, and he has scientific uh, data on climate and rainfall and agricultural production to back all of this up. But he makes the point, and others have made this point too, famine, a word we all know, famine is the result of state policy. The Irish famine of 1848-49 was the result of British imperial policy. The Indian famine that Mike Davis describes, and the Soviet famine of 1920-21 is not just insufficient rain. It's not just a bad crop year. It's deliberate state policy. It's the deliberate choices made by state officials that consign hundreds of thousands, or in this case, millions of people to death, victims of policy. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind when we talk about famines. Famines don't just happen, right? Famines are created through the poor decisions or the inaction of state actors. So horrific pictures like this of starving children, of children with distended bellies, victims of famine being carted away from the villages. Um, in the party archives, there are horrific accounts of cannibalism and criminal trials brought against those who were accused of murder and cannibalism, the extremes to which people have been broken, their sanity destroyed under these horrific conditions. Here you see photos from some of the criminal files of the Russian archives of the accused standing before their victims, and here too. I'll take it off that horrific image, but that's quite the eye-opener, isn't it? Soviet propaganda, meanwhile, again, blamed the kulaks for the famine. The famine could not be the result of Soviet power making mistakes. The famine was the result of class enemies in the village sabotaging the efforts of Soviet power to deliver food for all. So Soviet power issued posters like this: remember the starving, remember the hungry, and calling upon people, citizens of the Soviet Republic, to do their part to help in the relief effort. Again, always eager to turn a crisis into an opportunity, the Bolshevik regime used the famine as an opportunity to loot the churches and monasteries of the Russian Orthodox Church. There was a mass campaign to requisition, again, that very Civil War sounding word, to requisition church valuables to relieve the famine. And under those auspices, Lenin authorized a special committee of party elite to strip many of the monasteries and churches of their gold and jewels and treasured valuables. It must be said, and we now know through archival confirmation, very little, if any, of the value of those requisitioned church objects actually made their way into the mouths of the starving. What the Bolsheviks did, in fact, was shore up these treasure houses full of valuables and sell them abroad at profit to finance the international communist revolution. But again, the presence of the famine provided an opportunity for the Bolsheviks to deliver a blow against its enemy, the church. And the tragic part, of course, is that none of the church valuables requisitioned actually went to really help the hungry, the starving, those who needed it. One of the most famous images of the 1920s, this emaciated peasant with mere stalks of grain behind him, and the caption reads simply, "Pomagi," help, help. The situation was so bad that, and this, for the first and last time in Soviet history, the government allowed direct foreign aid to enter and operate inside Soviet Russia. The American Relief Administration, the ARA, which was headed by the future president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, the American Relief Administration took a very active role in famine relief. They raised money, they brought food into the country, they distributed it to families, and women and children especially. And you see this photo of an American official on the left and all of the starving, begging, hungry children crowding around. They raised more than $450 million in today's money. I mean, that's an astonishing sum. And noted writers and actors and cultural figures, celebrities around the world rushed to donate and support the cause. George Bernard Shaw, Albert Einstein, Theodore Dreiser, Anatole France, some of the great figures of the age. And this was sort of a black eye for the Bolsheviks, that they had to, as the Civil War was winding down, they had to admit into the country agents of foreign imperialist powers to feed the starving children of the Soviet Republic. This was a great humiliation, Lenin and company felt, but it would have been an even greater humiliation to have done nothing, because this would have damaged, Lenin feared, the Soviet regime's efforts to secure international recognition, diplomatic recognition from other countries around the world. Now, why would they care about that? To engage in arms deals, most notably with Germany, with the Weimar Republic. So there's a very duplicitous diplomatic game that's taking place here. It's not, again, humanitarianism or compassion that lets Lenin admit the ARA into Russia. It's rather a calculated consideration as part of a bigger, longer game that Lenin is playing on the diplomatic stage. But there's a lot of interesting work on the ARA if you're interested in reading more about that. I'd be happy to point you in those directions. The result of this, and here you see some officers helping with the distribution of food. These are Western officers, members of the ARA, soup and bread for the starving. Even with these efforts, it's estimated that 5 million Russians died as a direct result of the famine of 1920-21. And we might say a direct result of the failure of war communism. Coercive measures were not working. And this is the point I want to end on. Coercive measures could not put the economy back together again. Coercive measures could not catapult the economy forward from the rubble and debris of capitalism into the bright, shining new order of socialism. And the party is starting to realize this. Something has to be done. A new economic policy must be implemented. And that's the policy to which we'll turn in our next lecture. So let me get out of this, and when we resume, we'll talk about the transition from war communism to something new. So talk to you then. Thanks.